Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. So much of your personal info is out of your control, like your insurance provider that has your social security number and your favorite retailer that has your payment details. If they get breached, your information, your identity, is vulnerable. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points a second for threats. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hi, and welcome back to Amicus. This is Slate's podcast about the courts and the law and the Supreme Court. And I am Dahlia Lithwick. I cover these things for Slate. This week, Trumpism came to America, not as a surprise, but as an invited guest. It returns well-staffed with really explicit plans for deportation and deregulation and deep cuts to government services. It feels like it's returning on a red carpet with a compliant Supreme Court and a Senate majority and a mandate to fulfill many, many promises that Trump and J.D. Vance and the Heritage Foundation and Stephen Miller have kind of gleefully made to us. Many of those promises are really chilling. During this campaign, America was asked to imagine Donald Trump with no legal or institutional guardrails, and now I guess we will bear witness to that. We have devoted months and months of shows to warning against it, but this is not the moment, at least for me, to do the Monday morning quarterbacking of the campaign or to join in this delirious trashing of groups of voters who didn't do what I wanted. And it is certainly not time, I think, to wish pain on anyone, because pain is surely coming. In my view, it is the time to think about how best to mitigate what is about to come. I want to sort through the best ways for moderating what is coming, protecting the architecture of democracy, even as the sort of soft furnishings of democracy are being stripped away in front of our eyes. And I'm joined by a friend and a friend of this show, Ian Bassin, who, for me at least, has lit the way through so many dark times, in so many tapings, in so many tweets, in so many notes that he has sent over the years. Ian is co-founder and executive director of Protect Democracy. He previously served as associate White House counsel in the Obama administration, where he counseled the president and senior White House staff on administrative and constitutional law. He is also a class of 2023 MacArthur Fellow. Ian Bassin, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Dahlia. It's a tough week to be here.
And I'm just going to ask you this because I think a lot of people are forgetting to ask this. How are you? Are you okay?
You know, I think probably like a lot of people, it's hard. It's a tough moment to digest on so many levels. There is going to be a lot of, very harmful, dark, and upsetting things coming. And knowing that is difficult. And it makes it all the harder to do the things that we are going to need to find our way to do. And I think you alluded to this idea of holding up a light in darkness. And I think one way to think about our task ahead is to make sure that that light doesn't go out. It is going to be walking through a stretch that winds are going to blow at it. All sorts of different forces are going to try to snuff it to the point of extinguishment. And our job is to hold our hands around it and just keep it lit until we get to a place where we're past some of those winds. The oxygen is there, the sun is up, the surroundings are brighter, and we don't need to hold that candle anymore because the light is back all around us.
I think there are many reasons I wanted to talk to you this week, but I think chief among them was that at some level, I've said it on a lot of podcasts and shows this week, this win was quote unquote democratic, right? People voted. we will have a peaceful transfer of power. There's not going to be a Bush v. Gore. Nobody's going to say, stop the steal. There's not going to be a will be wild moment, right? President Biden made a speech in the Rose Garden, essentially asking people to just take down the temperature, accept this reality. Our friend Jeff Charlotte reacted to that, saying Biden's speech was just misinformation. A moderate or low information voter who tuned into that, not sure what to think, would have come away thinking that the Democrats had lost to a Mitt Romney or a John McCain. They would take it as permission to tune out again till 28. And I think one of the things that is just so hard in this particular cycle is that the whiplash is like off the charts. Trump is an existential threat to democracy. We've been saying that for 8 years. And then suddenly we say, well, people have spoken. See you in 4 years. And I guess I think about you as the sort of Yoda of democracy for me. And I'm trying to reconcile these two things that, voting, I guess, is democracy. And yet I think one of the things I've learned from you is that voting isn't the only pillar of democracy.
First, let's talk about what it means to have someone elected through a democratic process who has shown themselves to be fundamentally an opponent of the democratic process, right? That's a weird contradiction, but it is the situation we are in, where we've had an election where someone was elected through the democratic process, and the risk is that they will not allow that process to endure into the future. And it is a risk that we have seen play out around the world in the 21st century. And we've talked about this before as we warned about this moment, that what we have seen in the 21st century are leaders and movements that come to power through democratic elections, and then once in power, like Trojan horses, dismantle democratic systems from within so that they are able to entrench their powers and eliminate the possibility of being removed through the democratic process. Another way of thinking about it is that democracy, the way we understand it in the modern era, includes a number of elements, only one of which is electing leaders at regular intervals through free and fair elections. The other aspects of it, as we know, are that once those leaders are given temporary powers to represent us, we hand over our sovereignty to them for a temporary period to represent us, they are constrained by checks and balances, by the rule of law, by the protection of individual rights, in order to ensure that at the end of the day, our granting to them of our sovereignty, where it ultimately rests with we the people, is temporary, and that we get to take it back at the end of their term in office. And political scientists referred to everything I just described as liberal democracy, and we colloquially in this country simply refer to it as democracy. And what you're seeing with leaders like Donald Trump or Viktor Orban in Hungary is essentially the separating of those two things, the sort of cleaving off of the liberal part of liberal democracy, where if I win an election with the most votes, then all those other things, checks and balances, the rule of law, the protection of individual rights, they don't matter because I've been given a mandate to do away with all those other things, which is never how we in sort of the modern era have understood democracy. And what it represents is a threat to the fact that ultimately power is held by we the people, and that anyone who we elect to represent us only holds that power temporarily with our permission until it is time for us to take it back. And so what is fundamentally at risk here is the enduring of democracy after what took place this week. And it is up to us to hold fast to the popular sovereignty that the founders gave us in the first 3 words of the Constitution. We, the people, are the ones who ultimately self-govern through who we elect. And if we don't hold on to that, it will be taken from us. And that means we have to exercise all of the agencies that the founders gave us, because agency that you don't use is agency that you lose. And that's the task before us.
So last week we had Tim Snyder on the show, and I think his message was, when you think about freedom, particularly as an American and like out of a constitutional American construct, it's too narrow. I think what you have always brought to our conversations is that when we think of democracy, we think of it in too narrow a way. And if I'm hearing you correctly, Ian, I think what you just said is we have a tendency to think that democracy means anything that the United States of America does that looks like democracy. And that, I think, is the challenge, right? Is to say to people, there's so many pillars of democracy. I wonder if you would just remind us in all your work at Protect Democracy and all the ways that you think about what does democracy mean? Please give us your sort of best elevator pitch on what it is we should think about in the next 4 years when we think about what a democracy looks like.
I think at its root, democracy means that power rests with all of us. That the ultimate power to decide our future belongs to the people. It doesn't belong to a government. It doesn't belong to a president. It doesn't belong to any other elected representative or set of elected representatives. It belongs to us. And we can choose to give it to someone temporarily to enact an agenda that they promised to enact. But ultimately, we still hold the final keys. That's fundamentally what democracy is. And if any leader were to take a vote to put them in office for some temporary period of time as a total transfer of power from the people to them, they will fundamentally misunderstand democracy. And if we allow them to do that, they will fundamentally destroy democracy. And so an election is just that. It's a temporary grant of power to someone to govern for a period of time within the constraints of the system and then return power back to the people.
I want to talk about the Supreme Court for one quick minute. I think the first time you and I ever spoke on this show was about the Supreme Court. And I think if I were to start the film at this week, it would be like, well, you know, folks voted, stuff happened. President Biden says, take down the temperature. I think if I start the clock many, many years before, which includes, right, everything from Citizens United and how we finance campaigns and everything about how we think about corruption and everything about how we think about how we vote. And this past year, the Supreme Court rewriting the insurrection clause, rewriting how we think about presidential immunity, rewriting how we think about, January 6th insurrectionists, a Trump judge dismissing the entire classified document suit at Mar-a-Lago. There is a part of this story that I think you and I have been trying to tell for a long time, which is that the court is absolutely a player in the reimagining of democracy. And yet it is not a thing that for whatever reason we think about other than, for 2 weeks in June when we're angry about a decision. But the constitutional courts have rewritten what democracy, what voting, what liberty, what the presidency means in order to get us here.
I take everything that you said there to make an important point in all of this, which is that our democracy is far from perfect. It has always been far from perfect. It has had built into it a whole bunch of deep flaws from the very founding of it, some horrific and tragic flaws from the very founding of it, up to the modern era in which it has had flaws, as you note, that were introduced by the Supreme Court, for example, the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, the unleashing a tidal wave of big money into our politics, the many myriad ways that if we were to design a sort of platonic democracy, we would not include. But all democracies have been imperfect. And our task is both to recognize the imperfections, accept that the rules are part of sort of our journey together, and they don't fundamentally negate that, an election took place and somebody won it under the rules that exist at the time. Democracy doesn't work if you say, well, I reject all of those rules. Democracy works because we say, hey, those are the rules and we'd like to make them better, but those are the rules. And then we have to try to make them better. And I think this gets to when you sort of try to pick your head up from this moment and look further into the distance. What we need to see is that there is a better democracy that is out there in the distance, I like to think of it as a fourth founding of democracy. We had a first founding after the revolution that created our first deeply, deeply flawed, imperfect democracy. We had a second founding during Reconstruction after the Civil War that moved us a little further down the road towards something that might meet our highest aspirations. We had a third one in the middle of the 20th century after the Depression, 2 world wars, and the Civil Rights Movement. And none of those delivered the more perfect, truly inclusive democracy that I think we all aspire to have. And importantly, each one of those prior foundings was preceded by a period of crisis and conflict, many of which much more violent and destructive than so far the one we've been in. Hopefully it stays that way. But you had to get through a crucible to get there. I think we all had hoped that the crucible that we would need to get through to reach that fourth founding was the past 8 years, and that come January, we'd begin turning the page into that season of rebirth. And I think what is so hard about this moment is the realization that no, there is going to be a much darker challenge before us, and things are going to fall deeper away from what we want to ultimately achieve before we can turn that corner. But turn that corner, we will, somehow. And I think at this moment, the how and what it looks like is really hard to see. And that's really understandable. I think that the shock of this week, the fog and uncertainty of it makes it so that that fourth founding, that vision of what can be, is just obscured in the distance. But I think to the point of kind of cupping your hand around the candle, just keeping that light burning enough so that when the fog clears, we can see it is the task before us for the coming days and weeks. But it is out there, and it is our task to get us somehow through this stretch to it.
More in a moment with Ian Bassin. When creating your own business, the most important part is your ideas. So why let the headache of registering your business hold those ideas back? It's time to learn about a great idea that will keep you going and growing, LegalZoom. Over the last 20 years, LegalZoom has helped start, run, and protect millions of businesses. Launch, run, and protect your business to make it official today at LegalZoom.com and use promo code SlatePod to get 10% off any LegalZoom business formation product, excluding subscriptions and renewals. Expires December 31st, 2024. Get everything you need from setup to success at LegalZoom.com and use promo code SlatePod. LegalZoom.com and use promo code SlatePod. LegalZoom provides access to independent attorneys and self-service tools. LegalZoom is not a law firm and does not provide legal advice except where authorized through its subsidiary law firm, LZ Legal Services, LLC. After a night with drinks, it's tough to bounce back the next day. But with Zbiotics, there's a surefire way to wake up feeling fresh after a night of drinking. Zbiotics pre-alcohol probiotic drink is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. It's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. Pre-alcohol produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. Just remember to make Zbiotics your first drink of the night. Drink responsibly, and you'll feel your best tomorrow. Also, Zbiotics is continuing to invent probiotics that will help with everyday challenges of modern living. Go to zbiotics.com/amicus to learn more and get 15% off your first order when you use Amicus at checkout. Zbiotics is backed with 100% money-back guarantee, so if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember to head to zbiotics.com/amicus and use the code amicus at checkout for 15% off. Let's return now to my conversation with Ian Bassin. When we talk about perfecting democracy, when we talk about a more perfect union, when we talk about attempting to begin to construct the thing that has never been, the only way to get there, I think, is through power. And now we're having conversations, I'm having conversations that are about bearing witness, keeping people safe, mitigating harms. It's the opposite of power, right? It is the opposite of constructing this thing you're describing. It is just trying to hold the line. And I wonder if you could help me understand what the mission is. I understand absolutely for the next couple of weeks, it's cupping the flame. And as we're taping this, we don't know what's going to happen in the House. But absent meaningful structural power in the courts, presidency, the Senate, in many, many states, is it just about bearing witness? Is it just about making sure that the historical record is complete? Because I know what declining democracies look like, and I don't want to be at the part where all we're doing is taking good notes, Ian.
Well, there's a lot of trying to understand the electorate this week. And I've always found that those exercises where right after an election, the punditry looks at it and says, well, what the American people said was this. And, clearly we now know that America means this. And in the era that I've been alive, in which pretty much every election is an incredibly close nail-biter, I find that to be sort of a bizarre exercise. 150 plus million people probably voted this week. And the election ultimately was decided in 3 states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, by right now it looks like about 30,000 votes in Wisconsin, about 80,000 votes in Michigan, about 130,000 votes in Pennsylvania. Those numbers might change slightly, but add them up, it's less than 250,000 votes. Less than 250,000 votes out of 150 million cast, which is about 0.001% of those votes. To draw the conclusion that that means X and not Y strikes me as a vast overreading of the situation. Do we need to learn lessons from what happened? Absolutely. Donald Trump gained ground in pretty much every demographic group, in pretty much every region of the country, rural, suburban, urban. Clearly, there are lessons to be learned, and we'd be foolish if we ignored them. And at the same time, we shouldn't overlearn them. Project 2025, for example, was wildly unpopular in and of itself. People fundamentally, to the extent that you're trying to read what that 0.001 tilt said, the number one issue was the economy. The number two issue was immigration. People fundamentally, and this is happening around the world right now, don't feel like their lives are the way they want them to be. And this is causing incumbents to be thrown out of office around the world, and they're being thrown out of office from the left if the incumbents are on the right, or from the right if the incumbents are on the left. They're being thrown out of office whether, quote-unquote, democracy is on the ballot or whether, quote-unquote, democracy is not on the ballot. Incumbents are being thrown out of office based on a general dissatisfaction with publics across the world with the quality of their current lives. And so if there's something we need to do, we need to focus on how do we deliver a greater quality of life and respond to that concern. But to read a 50-50 roughly electorate as casting a ballot in favor of all of the most extreme things that the sort of Trump movement and Trump have promised to do, I think is a misread. And I think it's actually a more dangerous misread potentially for Donald Trump than it is for the rest of us. Because if he is smart, he will try to address those quality of life issues that were the number one issue for voters. If he is not, he will try to implement the most dangerous and worst and most extreme aspects of his agenda. And if he does that, I suspect there will be deep buyer's remorse among the public. Now, the question is, will that buyer's remorse have avenues and channels, as you note, and power to constrain a presidency that, in its worst form, could simply try to squash that dissent and hold on to power regardless of its popularity? That is going to be the real challenge before us. I was talking to someone the other night who pointed out that in 1972, when Richard Nixon was reelected, he was elected with 49 states, and 9 months later was politically dead. Now, Do I think that we are in a similar situation to then? No. It is not a similar situation. No, there is not going to be, an attempted impeachment the way there was in 1973. It would be a mistake to do that. That didn't work the first time as a response to overreach. But is it a sign that the future is uncertain and unknowable and that things can change rapidly in American politics? It is. To win 49 states and then be politically impotent 9 months later is a dramatic turnabout. And we did not just witness a 49 state landslide. We witnessed a 50+1 nail-biting victory. And what Nixon fundamentally did that was his undoing was he became arrogant and he overshot the mark. He ordered aggressive foreign policies in Cambodia and Laos. He ordered the plumbers to go after his opponents. He overread a 49-state mandate, and it cost him. And I think that's probably a lesson for our president-elect. And the question for us is, if he does that, will we be able to channel that public backlash into a political movement, political power to constrain what otherwise could be an unconstrained presidency? And that will be a very, very difficult task for all the reasons that you note, but not an impossible one.
There's two things you said that just set little different quadrants of my brain on fire. One, your definition of democracy, which is ultimately that the people are in charge. And then your point that, the reason incumbents keep losing every cycle is because people feel powerless, right? Like, nobody said when Biden won, everybody was, rejecting Trump and Trumpism. He won by a little, right? And he won by a little. And
right. America no more rejected Trumpism by 7 million votes in 2020 than it approved Trumpism by what will probably be about 3 million votes in 2024. It's the same country in both of those elections.
So what you're saying is that in the most sort of abstract way, when people who feel powerless take power, they say, I didn't like the last thing. This was not a referendum on democracy, the way we keep saying, oh, people want fascism. It's a referendum on what is being executed in a democratic way, right? I think that's what you're saying. And I think maybe the other thing that you're saying that's really useful for my purposes is that to feel hopeless in this moment is to, in fact, give Donald Trump the power to detain millions of people in camps, right? It is to give him the power to have, military tribunals for his enemies. And I think the power still lies with us. We have to now figure out what that's going to look like, that when those things that nobody wanted in Project 2025, if and when they start to happen, what power looks like, absent waiting for 4 years, to stop it. And I guess that raises for me the question of, what is the agenda? I mean, the thing you said that was interesting is, after that election, Nixon became arrogant. My God, Donald Trump was arrogant when he was 6. Like, he's not going to become arrogant. He thinks he is the law. What is he going to bring upon us in the first months? And will he be at all constrained by the thing that you say will constrain him, which is that the public will hate it?
Look, you brought up Tim Snyder before, and I think his first adage is crucial. And that was, do not obey in advance. What authoritarian movements do is they grind people down. They exhaust people, and they intimidate people into retreating from public spaces. And the first step in having any opportunity to hold on to the power of the people and serve as, an ultimate check is to not do that, to be in community with one another, to be in public, to continue to proclaim the values that are still at the heart of this country, even if it didn't feel that way, look that way with the results of this week's election. There are still many more good and decent people in this country than otherwise. And reaching out and staying connected with them and tapping into that goodness is a strength of ours. And that's a first step, so that if we do see the shock and awe that I think we should expect, that has been promised by Trump and in what he will do when he takes office, from the rounding up of the undocumented population, to the going after political opponents, to the gutting of federal agencies and expertise. If he does all of those things in ways that offend the fundamental sensibilities of the American people and don't address their material well-being that was the sort of dominant cause of their vote, there's an opportunity where the people will turn against that. And I am not naive about the incredible power that a unchecked Trump will have with all levers of the federal government behind him. So I don't want to be spinning fantasy yarns about how possible it will be to place a check on it. But at the same time, the power of the American public is still a powerful force. And if that public will fundamentally organizes against Trumpian overreach, it is going to change political dynamics in this country. You cannot run a fascist government in the United States as just one person. You need the support of thousands to be able to do that. Thousands within the executive branch, thousands throughout the states, allies in the other branches of government. And all those other people are also subject to public opinion and political will in all sorts of ways, direct, electorally, and indirect. And if the president-elect's approach becomes quickly deeply unpopular and faces backlash from across the public, those Republicans in Congress who have to run in 2 years and 4 years, they're going to have to take stock of that and what it means for them against what will be, sort of a presidency in its second term. And so that is not to suggest that that will be easy. It is not to suggest that there aren't ways to thwart all of that, sort of democratic will. There are, and the hill that we will face will be steep. But the power of the American public remains a monumental force that we should not ignore or take lightly.
Okay, so I know you're not a media critic, but one of the things that I did want to ask you about is that it seems, and I just want to start by agreeing with you that I think a lot of these postmortems about, if only she'd picked a different vice president, right? If only they'd messaged, X or Y differently, this would have turned out differently. I don't think that's a super useful enterprise right now. I do think the conversations about the media ecosystem we're living in right now scare me a little. I notice that you're still on Twitter. I guess we'll call it X. I notice that I'm still on Twitter. I guess we'll call it X. I notice that there's a robust conversation about young men and podcasts that I didn't fully understand until this election. I slightly wonder if you had a magic wand. What do we do to fix the way messaging about this election, about democracy, as you say, about the choice between the parties? This does not feel like a healthy way to have a conversation about the high stakes issues that you're raising. And I guess I just wonder, on the show, we just call it the Elon Musk of it all. But I wonder how we manage to sort of extract ourselves from an information ecosystem that seems very overdetermined to continue to mislead all of us about what the real stakes are.
Yeah, I'm glad you said I'm not a media critic, because I'm not. So let me caveat by saying that there are people far more expert than I to weigh in on this question. But here's one simple way, at least that I think about it, which is that the legacy media institutions, America's newspapers, America's television networks, largely are dominated by people and communities that are wed to kind of Enlightenment, 20th century liberal democratic values. That's sort of the ethos from, sort of ABC to the New York Times. Whereas the 21st century media entities, social media from TikTok to X, podcasting, other ways of sort of delivering messages are dominated by a post-liberal democratic, more illiberal vision, personified by someone like the owner of X, or in the case of TikTok, the Chinese Communist Party. And so that's a real asymmetry, right? If the media of today and tomorrow is dominated by a post-liberal, post-democratic vision, then that is going to be a problem for the liberal democratic vision. And so I think there are, broadly speaking, a couple ways that one might think about approaching that. One is that those sort of people who still value liberal democratic forms of government are going to need to figure out ways to build up a stakehold and a footing in the 21st century media ecosystem, which just has not really happened at any level of scale at this point in time. And so that's the first thing. And then I think the second thing, which is probably at an even greater level of abstraction and remove, is that I look at every former period of new media technologies coming onto the scene as telling a story of initial deep disruption and leading to real sort of conflict and chaos. And that goes for the invention of the printing press, right? Which allowed people to say, oh, wow, you mean the town that lives on the other side of the hill thinks that? Holy, I don't want someone living on the other side of the hill to think that. I better go and kill them. And you had, decades of wars in Europe as people read the pamphlets from over the other side of the hill and said, I can't believe someone says that's a good life. They threaten my good life. I'm going to go kill them. And it took an awful lot of bloodshed before people said, maybe this constant killing the people on the other side of the hill is not such a great idea. And the Enlightenment gives birth to liberalism. And we find ways of, metabolizing the printing press to turn into a tool of great progress. And I think you see a similar story with the invention of radio and television. Obviously, Leni Riefenstahl was one of the first people to figure out how to use the moving image as a powerful and dangerous political tool. And an enormous amount of suffering followed. And tragedy followed. And then we, at great cost, figured out how to metabolize that new technology. And, the latter part of the 20th century saw great advances through the use of some of those new media technologies. And I think we're in a moment that probably echoes those, where a whole bunch of new media technologies have been injected into the bloodstream and are being incredibly disruptive to the body politic, causing a whole bunch of harm and conflict and hopefully less violence than those earlier periods, but we will metabolize it. And in the long run, I expect that, history will look back and say, we found a way to use it for good. And I think the question and the challenge for us is, can we minimize the harms on the way to get there?
We are going to take a short break.
It's game time. And if you've got a hunch about this NBA season, you could turn it into a big win on FanDuel. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win.
Ooh, that guy's hotter than a microwave burrito.
Now that's a red-hot hunch.
21 plus and present in Virginia. Must be first online real money wager. $5 deposit required. Bonus issued is non-withdrawable bonus vest that expires 7 days after receipt. Restrictions apply. See full terms at FanDuel.com/sportsbook. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER.
Ford Pro FinSimple offers flexible financing solutions for all kinds of businesses, whether you're an electrician or run an organic farm. Because we know that your business demands financing that works when you need it, like when your landscaping company lands a new account. Wherever you see your business headed, Ford Pro FinSimple can help you pursue it with financing solutions today. Get started at fordpro.com/financing.
Let's return now to my conversation with Ian Bassin of Protect Democracy. Okay, so here's a feelings ball question, and you can tell me you have no answer, and that's fine. But 2016, there was a women's march. Everybody gave money to the ACLU. Lawyers showed up at airports with their laptops, right? It was all out there. I'm thinking about the How Democracies Die warning that we need the Academy to be in the game. We need the American Bar Association to be in the game. We need the medical, right? The stuff that didn't happen in 2016 may not happen. And the stuff that did happen in 2016 may not happen. Are we sliding backward in terms of our ability to, I don't even want to use the word resistance, I'm going to say it, but like to do the resistance work that like felt really great and cool and collective, and there was a real plan about putting our bodies in the game. have we so wearied and have the institutions, including big business, so not even ever showed up that we're behind where we were then?
Well, if you go back to the election in 2016, none of the things that you just talked about were happening the Friday after the election, which is when we are currently recording this. So I think the first thing I would say is it's early. We are all still processing what has just happened. I think for many of us, we're in various states of shock and despair about it. And I think it's too early to really assess where we are and where we will be. We will do that in the coming days and in the coming weeks. And we will need to find a way to muster all the things that we've been talking about over the last, 30 to 40 minutes, which is to channel the last bastion of power that, we who still believe in a liberal democratic vision of government have, which is the public. And other publics around the world have proven that that can be done. I look to a country like Poland, where a, sort of illiberal, more autocratic-leaning party was in power and began to dismantle many of the institutions of liberal democracy there. And, there were many observers around the world who thought that, Poland had slid past the place where, the people could assert their will in an election. And then at the end of last year, the Polish public threw that party out of power and shocked everybody. Our institutions, on the one hand, are much stronger, older, and more resilient than the Poles. And on the other hand, you can make arguments that the forces that have taken power here are perhaps even more threatening, dangerous, and consolidated than in Poland. So, you can make arguments on both sides as to whether we're in better or worse shape, but there are lots of models around the world, that one or others, where publics have managed to defend their core values against a governmental assault on fundamental popular sovereignty. And I would not underestimate the danger we face of a fundamentally illiberal, anti-democratic, authoritarian regime and movement undermining the foundations of American democracy. I also would not underestimate the ability, the will, the commitment of the American people to preserve it.
Ian, I feel like I'm going to land where I always land with you, which is that most of our listeners, including this guy, would love to know what needs to be done in the most granular, tangible sense, what we should be doing. And I say this in the face of what you already described. Tyranny, illiberalism thrive in isolation. They thrive in fear, right? They thrive in, I'm just going to stop. I'm going to check out. I'm going to, take care of my garden. I'm all for gardening, by the way. I'm going to just hit pause and, cherish my bruised heart for a couple of years. And I just want you to walk me through, and you said this already, what this fourth founding, what this thing that we need to get to and get through this to get to it, what that requires from us starting tomorrow and for every day for the next couple of years.
Open up your email application, whatever it is, pop into the 2-line, as many people as you can in your community, in your life, in your workplace, and send a note around to all of them that says, this is a tough moment, but it is crucial in this moment that we all stay united and committed to the values that we share, to decency, to honesty, to care for one another, to freedom of speech, to freedom of expression, to dignity and equal treatment, and to being willing to speak out and stand up when those values are threatened. I'm willing to do that with all of you. Are you willing to do it with me? Because if we say we're willing to do that with each other, there's strength just in us saying that. And let's move this off of email and let's all meet up together in a public space, in a park, in a place of worship, in a community center, And let's talk about what it means to stay in touch with each other and united in defense of those values. Sign it and hit send. That's a simple step of reaching out to people in our communities, in our lives, and saying, I'm with you, I believe in these values, and I'm willing to stand with you if you'll stand with me in defense of them. That is where politics starts. That is what Alexis de Tocqueville called the habits of the heart of democracy in our modern era, where democracy is not just a system of laws or a set of elections, but it's a life practice of people who work together with others to set a collective destiny. And it is crucial in this moment that we hold fast to that, because the alternative is to retreat, as you noted, into solitude. And that is how the flame of democracy flickers out. So open up your email, send that to as many people in your life as you can, and then lean into what they say in response and hold fast to each other and stand up for those values. And from there, we can build a movement that ensures that we get through this dark period and deliver a fourth founding of a democracy that is responsive to what everyone wants, that is resilient, that includes everyone, and that is more perfect than any we've ever had before.
Ian Bassin is co-founder and executive director of Protect Democracy. He previously served as associate White House counsel in the Obama administration. He's a class of 2023 MacArthur Fellow. And Ian, I just want to say, I had to really gather myself up to have this conversation today, because I was in just like shattered bits. But I also felt that this is the sort of conversation that we need to have in order to get through what just feels like a massive systemic shock. And there's no one I wanted to do it with more than you. So I thank you. I know you probably had to gather yourself up a little bit too. And I thank you for spending an hour with us today to help a whole lot of people, I hope, find some path to keeping that light alive. Thank you.
Oh, I needed this too. Thank you.
That's all for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. And thank you so much for all of your notes to me and to Mark after Wednesday's Amicus Plus episode. If you haven't listened yet, it's in the feed right before this one. And a special thank you to our Slate Plus subscribers for making it possible to share that conversation with all of our listeners on the day the election was called. You can subscribe to Slate Plus directly from the Amicus show page on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or visit slate.com/Amicus Plus to get access to weekly bonus episodes and ad-free versions of our podcasts wherever you listen. You can keep in touch at amicus@slate.com, or you can find us at facebook.com/Amicus Podcast. Sarah Birmingham is Amicus's senior producer. Our producer is Patrick Fort. Alicia Montgomery is vice president of audio at Slate. Susan Matthews is Slate's executive editor, and Ben Richmond is our senior director of operations. We'll be back with another episode of Amicus next week.